Tonight we're going to talk about a perennial hot topic, and that's cybersecurity, of course, um, and where it sits in relation to national security policy and also foreign policy. And one of the countries that has taken a sort of lead in developing policies around cybersecurity is Estonia. We have a lot to learn, I think, in Australia from Estonia, and we have someone here who is very well placed to tell us what the lessons that we should learn are. And that's Kersti Eisma, who was until very recently, until last year, the ambassador to the Republic of Estonia um, here in Canberra. At the moment, she's the brand ambassador for women in cybersecurity under the Work Path Australia program, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Tartu and a master's degree in business consultations with honours from the Estonian Business School. And I'm sure she has a lot to tell us today about Estonian experience and cybersecurity in general. So I will hand the floor over to her.
Of course. Good evening to everyone. And the most difficult task for me will be actually not to move around. Because Estonians, normally we are very Nordic. We don't talk a lot and we don't, you're slightly taller than me. And we are very introvert, except former diplomats. We love to talk, and I'm almost Italian by that sense that I use a lot of my hands. So when I go out of we have people online, right? So hello, everybody online as well. When you don't see me, then please guide me back to so people can see me. I want to start with something. I can see a lot of young people in the room. And I want to start with a story when I was 22. Anybody here 22? Oh, there you go. I joined the Estonian Foreign Service when I was 22. So straight after the University of Tartu. And I believe that your first job as a diplomat or your first posting a little bit defines you as a diplomat. As a diplomat. I know we have definitely one former diplomat in the room. Any other diplomats or former diplomats? Aspiring diplomats wanting to become a diplomat? But I don't know, Jane, if you would agree with me, but I've always believed that your first job or your first posting defines you as a diplomat. And just before we were talking, it's a little bit like your training. My first job was to help Estonia to become part of the World Trade Organization. And my first posting a couple of years later was to Geneva, to UN and to WTO and a couple of other international organizations. So my diplomatic DNA was very much about respecting international rules, multilateral order, conflict prevention, territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes, and many other principles that we know from UN Charter. But to put it very simply, anybody studying here international relations, I assume people are, that's probably the reason why you're here. It came me as a young person, as a 22-year-old, understanding that world can agree how to treat each other in good times, how to treat each other in bad times. So we can all come together as world and say, okay, we get along at the moment, we agree on the rules. So when we have a fight, we have established some rules how to deal with it. When I later transferred to bilateral and regional diplomacy, then of course learned that on top of these international rules, countries can have bilateral agreements that go even further and even, more preferential treatment as far as predictability is concerned. Estonia, of course, is part of the European Union, NATO, so that was our layer of those regional rules. Today we're going to talk about cyber, and when I discussed the topic with Heben, and I thought cyber is very scary to a lot of people. And they're like, I'm not going to go to a talk that talks about cyber, but I hope that at the end of this, you feel a little bit more comfortable. And you being here shows already that you're comfortable with this. On cyber, countries decide to agree on rules. So first it was about 25 countries who came together in the UN and said, let's discuss how international law applies to cyber. And they were 25 countries who were quite like-minded. Estonia was one of those countries, Australia was one of those countries. And then they decided, now we go to the whole UN, because UN rules are only good when everybody in the UN agrees to them. And there were good efforts made. I think that's how I would describe it. There was no agreement whether international law applies to cyber. There were different understanding whether we need a separate law or separate charter, or whether we can just say that international law applies to cyber. But at least we were talking to each other in UN. So I would say when I go back to that time, and I guess first 15 years of my career, maybe even 20 career, I think as a diplomat, as a human being, as a citizen of a very young country, Estonia only became independent again in 1991. I think I thought we are good. The world is good. Diplomats are doing important jobs to make sure that, you know, we are safe and wars don't happen. And if they happen, we can still treat each other as human beings. Now in 2025, I'm not so sure anymore. We do have wars. I mean, obviously, the country I'm coming from, Estonia, the closest war to us is war against Ukraine, where I think most of us can agree that those rules that I described as part of my DNA have been broken. We have trade wars. And again, I was dealing with international trade for 13 years of my career. And I remember as a young diplomat, I used to talk about how useful WTO is and how we can make sure that nobody raises the tariffs because we have tariff bindings and ceilings. And I was really believing in it. And now in 2025, WTO can't really act on those rules because the dispute settlement body is basically not functioning. And for today's topic, I think it's safe to say we have cyber wars. And then when I was thinking about today's topic, I was thinking, if we would have agreed on those international rules, which we were not able to do, would that be helpful? And then it made me think, probably not, because if we can't even respect those rules in the wars or in the trade, would they be applicable in the cyber? So I didn't feel too bad that those rules were not agreed in the UN. But number of my foundations in that diplomatic DNA have basically been thrown out of the window. And especially in cyber, when you think of a cyber attack by a country to a country, then often that country can say, no, it wasn't me. And it's very hard to say that it was that country. It's almost like my 6-year-old leaving his dirty dishes and saying, no, wasn't me. They just came from somewhere. And when I say cyber war, it's a very strong word. And those of you who study international relations, you probably study the meaning of that word. As a diplomat, we don't use that word lightly. Any lawyers in the room? As a lawyers, we don't use that word lightly. Politicians definitely don't use that word lightly. I don't think we have any politicians here. But I'm no longer a diplomat. I left the diplomatic service 1 year ago. I've never been a lawyer, and I don't think I'm going to be a politician. So for today, I'm going to use that word, a war, a cyber war. Because if you think of, I don't know what other word to use. If there's a country that attacks other country in cyberspace, and the achieve is to, with the aim to achieve its foreign policy goals, to intimidate societies by creating disruption, fear, uncertainty, undermine current government, or just have cyber espionage to prepare for an attack, maybe in the future. And that takes me back to the first cyber war in the world. Any guesses where that was? Magic, huh? What a coincidence, I'm here. So yes, the first cyber war, and when I was still a diplomat, I would never use that word for those reasons. I always used to say first national level cyber conflict, because war has a meaning. This took place, any guesses when? 2007. Yeah. But that was, if my math is correct, 18 years ago. So what happened? Our prime minister at the time decided that it's time to move a monument for an unknown Soviet soldier from the middle of the city, Tallinn, that is the capital, to the military cemetery. And he decided to do that in April, because every time 9th of May, the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia would celebrate Victory Day, which I believe is the end of the Second World War for them. And they gathered around this monument, and we felt this is not good. And it's time to move that monument with all the respect that is needed to military cemetery. And the Russian-speaking pro-Russian minority that we have in Estonia, they did not like that. And they wanted to show the government, so they went to the streets to protest, to show that they are against it. This is wrong. This takes away their identity as a Russian-speaking minority in Estonia, blah, 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 blah. And there were riots on the street, which some people used to break into the windows and maybe steal a bottle of vodka or something more expensive. But basically, society was having unrest. Then one morning, Estonians woke up and they decided, let's read some news. They opened the news portal, page not available. Then they decided, maybe I called somebody. The service is not available. Then they thought, let's see if my salary has arrived to the bank. They opened the bank site. Any guesses? Page not available. And then finally, they said, oh, something is going on. Let's go to the government site. Page not available. So nothing was available. And that was the first cyber attack or cyber war, as I was describing. It paralyzed our society. And if you take in parallel what was going on the streets, it was a very difficult time for Estonia. It paralyzed our society for a couple of weeks. This all happened 18 years ago, so, a while ago. And I think we learned 3 things from this event: national level cyber conflict, war. And yeah, by the way, going back to the word war, when I was describing before, it can also mean different things to different countries, like war against Ukraine. What does Russia say? Military operation, or even a situation. And you probably saw that. Anyway, I'm not going to go there, but you probably saw the Putin press conference with the faces that Putin was making. Anyway, back to the cyber. We learned 3 major things, I guess, from that cyber attack 18 years ago. First of all, we learned cyber is not technical. Do we have anybody here who studies cyber, like on a technical? Good. No? Yes? Good? No? Good? Bad? Anyway, but we learned cyber is not technical. And I often speak here in Canberra, in Australia, in cyber conferences. I think first I was like a token female speaking about cyber, because often in cyber, everybody is male and they needed a female face talking about cyber. And then I often started my speech like with a room full of cyber experts, 99% male. I started, I'm so sorry, I'm not technical. Now I've stopped doing that. I always start my speech, I'm in cyber, I work in cyber. But we learned that cyber is not technical. It's part of national security, because it's a very cheap and effective way for another country to attack, or for a country to attack another country. And especially, of course, if that country is not a friendly one. And Russia, for us, definitely was not a friendly one. And for us, it was a clear indication that cyber had become part of Russian foreign policy. So it was very clear for us, as our number one concern, it had to become part of our foreign policy. Just as an example, we did 2 things. We adopted within 1 year, which I think is pretty much a record in the world, we adopted a national cybersecurity strategy. Do you think we were the first in the world to do that? I thought so too. And then I asked ChatGPT, and it seemed we were not. But probably ChatGPT makes mistakes. But we were at least one of the first ones who adopted a formal and overall cybersecurity strategy. And the second thing that we did, we established the NATO Center of Excellence for Cyber in Tallinn, because we realized we need that as part of our national security. The second thing that we learned is, any of you been to Estonia? Anybody else been to Estonia? Do you know anything about Estonia? Estonia is this digital wonderland, or wunderkind of the Europe. We love everything digital. We don't like to talk to people, we like to send emails. That's part of our national DNA. But we had built already by then, 2007, a digital society. We're very proud of that. By that time, we already had digital identity for, I think, about 5 years. And we kind of enjoyed that lifestyle. And then we suddenly realized that fairy tale doesn't exist anymore, because what's the bad figure in a fairy tale? Evil godmother, or just the evil force? Or we realized that there's other side to that coin, which is cyber, and if we want to enjoy that digital society, we need to also make sure that it's safe as far as cyber is concerned. And to give you maybe example here, we established a data embassy because we realized we are geographically so close to Russia. We have a border with Russia. We need to make sure that our data that is obviously, at least at that time, was mostly still on servers, not in a magical cloud. What if there's a bomb and destroys that data? So we decided to create a data embassy. We went to Luxembourg to do that. So all of Estonian data is backed up there. Now, of course, much of it is in the cloud. And the third thing that we learned is whole of government response is needed, and also better collaboration with private sector, because when we looked at that attack, it wasn't only for government or prime minister's office, it was for all the government departments, and it was also to a lot of private sector enterprise like banks, for example. So we can't act in a silo anymore. That was also the purpose of the cybersecurity strategy. And maybe to give you an example, what we did here, we established a defense league for cyber, meaning that we also understand this needs to become part of our official defense policy. Estonia obviously is not alone. You can find many examples from Europe that have gone through similar things. I think we were one of the first one, as I said, 18 years ago. There was a recent example in Norway. I don't know if you heard about it when you went there, but the Russian hackers took control of a dam opening floodgate. It went unnoticed for 4 or 5 hours. That was officially attributed to Russia. There was Romanian elections, if anybody has heard about them. They had to be cancelled because there were 85,000 cyber attacks from 33 countries, which means it was well-coordinated attack. What Estonia, more specifically, we have seen ever since 2022, which is, of course, the start of the war against Ukraine, the attacks have just gone up. And we can see a very clear link between a decision where we support Ukraine or a decision that Russia doesn't like, and the very same day that attacks go up. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out who's behind that. You might ask me, is that even relevant in Australia? What attacks do you know about? Optus, Medibank, Qantas, anything else? ESOS, pardon? ANU? Does this concern Australia, do you think? Does Australia is the victim of or the target of politically motivated attacks? Well, I don't represent any Australian agency. I'm sure at some point you would have a speaker here who could tell you more what Australia officially says about that or how much it can say. But there is publicly available information to say that, yes, this is happening. Not, of course, as much as in Estonia, but it is. For example, in 2019, before the federal election, there was attack on most political parties. And I think Prime Minister described it at the time as by a sophisticated state actor. Also in 2024, when Australia had a specific decision to support Ukraine, there was an unprecedented wave of DDoS attacks against government and transport and logistics entities. So again, coincidence? Something that is quite specific in Australia, but also in other countries like US, is something that we call pre-positioning, which means that another country, and I'm not going to say which country, pre-positions its espionage, I would call it, in Australian government and critical infrastructure networks in order to be ready. And obviously, when you look into that, it's attributed officially by Australian government. And this is almost worse than our situation, because imagine, I don't know, you have a neighbor who kind of is annoying openly, then at least you can deal with it. I don't know. He pushes over a rubbish bin every rubbish day, or just does something that is quite evident, and you can go to the police or you can do something. What if that neighbor just steals your mail and you don't even know about it? So I think in some sense, Australia is almost in a worse situation compared to Estonia or Europe, because at least these attacks are open and quite visible, and they are not sitting somewhere like a silent duck waiting when they would need it. But Australian government is obviously very concerned about it and often speaks with Five Eye partners about it openly. So I do think there's a problem in Australia as well. And that takes me, what could Australia learn from Estonia and other countries in Europe when it comes to the situation we are in 2025? And maybe also, where do you think Estonia learns from? Which countries? Where do we look? Who is attacked even more? Oh, they're too big for us. Ukraine. Obviously, in Ukraine, in addition to the traditional war, military war, you can see from the news how much cyber is used. And when we want to be scared, we talk to Ukraine, and we talk to them a lot because we want to be not only scared, but prepared. And I think the same is important for every country. You look at other countries who are in a worse situation than you are, and you prepare for the worst. And again, I think there's three things. You probably understand now, I like number 3. There's 3 things that Australia could more specifically learn from Estonia and other countries in Europe. In case of political tension in the region, conflict or something bigger, cyber attack will be part of it. And I'm not saying might, maybe, probably, definitely it will be part of it. I don't think Australia is naive about it. When I talk to government agencies, they all agree. But I think Australian society as a whole is not prepared, especially more specifically on critical infrastructure, which is, of course, the most vulnerable part of companies, because I talk to a lot of those companies, and I talk to a lot of people about either our experience or what Australia is doing. And I almost see this almost thinking like cyber attack is okay, because the worst thing that can happen, they will have my frequent flyer Qantas number. And, Optus happened. People, okay, my passport, driving license number, this was lost. In a real conflict situation, in cyber attack, you wake up and you open your computer or phone and it says page not found, or the electricity is gone, or the water is not there, or the heating is not working, which in Canberra would be a catastrophe, right? But it's when I compare how people look at cyber attacks in Estonia, it's really part of that national security, having access to those basic services, electricity, water, heating, very important in Estonia as well. While here, it's more the loss of data and privacy that people are more concerned about. So it's just a different understanding. But my point is, when there would be a political conflict in the region, and when we look at defense papers that are being issued by Australian government, I think they say, I don't remember anymore. I was quoting it all the time as a diplomat, but they say something like, the conflict in the region is likely within 10 years. I think that's sort of what the Australian defense papers are preparing for. But the same should be true for cyber. And in some sense, when you look at Estonia, you might almost expect more in cyber. What is the likelihood that a hostile other country reaches Australian continent? What is the likelihood? Pretty low. You are an island, we are an island. We are far away, and there's lots of sea to kind of see if somebody is coming. But at the same time, when there is a conflict in the region, Australia has committed to protect that region. So what Australia would do is pretty much what Estonia is doing for Ukraine, which is making sure that it does everything possible to help that region, that whoever is under attack. And then whoever is the other side of that attack might specifically target Australia on cyber because you don't know who is behind it. It's cheap, and it will create exactly what Russia is creating in Estonia, which is people are not happy, it's instability. And some people might think, why shouldn't we only protect Australia? Why should we lose electricity because we are trying to protect the region? Why shouldn't I have access to my, everything that I'm used to because we are trying to be a good neighbor? And that's exactly what Russia is trying to do in Estonia and in Europe. So the first lesson is it will happen and we have to be prepared. The second lesson is in cyber, the saying practice makes perfect, not true in cyber. But it's definitely better than not practicing. What's the best way to learn in cyber attack? The best way to learn is to be attacked. This is the best training you can ever have. That's why Estonia is so good in cyber, because we have a lot of actual attacks happening. Again, I wouldn't recommend that as part of your training program. So what's the next best solution is to have cyber exercises. The problem or the challenge, whatever word I use, the drama in Australia is that a lot of companies are doing cyber exercises, but they're tabletop exercises mostly. Why? Because it's easier to do, it's cheaper, and you kind of get that nice feeling that I'm prepared. Have you ever done tabletop? Do you understand tabletop is basically you get a piece of paper that says, this is scenario now, what would you do? And then the cyber people would do, oh, we would do that. And the board would say, oh, we would have a press release. And the legal people would say, da, 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 da. While the live fire exercise is when attacks actually happen and you have to deal with it. So what we learned is tabletop is not enough. It gives you that nice feeling with drinking coffee and having bickies that you're prepared. And too many Australian companies are meeting SOCI requirements, which is the act that defines critical infrastructure, by doing those exercises, while in real life they are not ready what's coming. And the third, I guess, lesson is better collaboration between industry and government. Every conference I go to, It's the theme of the day, and we all discuss how to make it better, and we all discuss we need to make it better. And then I think what you could learn from Estonia, what's the actual practical thing that you can make it better? And something that worked really well for us was establishment of cyber reserve, both the defense reserve, but even more importantly, civil reserve. I was glad to note a few weeks ago, ADF announced that they are doing this. They were inspired by a few countries in the world, including a country called Estonia, which I felt a bit proud. And UK more specifically, so defense reserve is happening in cyber. And it's interesting area because normally when you go to anybody here in the reserve, or no, normally when you go to Australian Defence Reserve, you have to do a lot of things. I don't know how many push-ups and medical and da-da-da-da-da. In cyber, that doesn't necessarily define you as a good protection for Australia. So they're trying to think of ways, how could you become part of reserve without going through all of that lengthy and quite difficult process of becoming a reservist. Another thing that is different from cyber reserve in defense is often the professional defense, or the, who do it for work, are much more have better skills than people working in an office all day and then suddenly they need to shoot a gun. While in cyber, it might be the other way around, because in industry, you often are better paid and you have access to different tools. So it might actually bring an extra level of capability to defense. The second thing that Australia could learn from Estonia is also the civil element of it, that not everybody wants to be part of Defence Reserve. Some people want to give back to the community as a cyber professional or even policy professional. They don't necessarily want to join Defence Reserve. So we could think how to create that civil reserve in Australia. So even students who study cyber or even cyber policy could be part of that and give back to the society. And more importantly, work together as government, defense, academia, young people, older people who have left careers, who only start their careers, professionals, and they could all work together and learn from each other. So these 3 lessons, I leave you with these. And in conclusion, what I would say, for us, the wake-up call was 18 years ago, and we really did wake up. When I saw Optus and Medibank attack, I was being a diplomat. I thought, good, this is the wake-up call to Australia. And to some extent it was, but then I think I've now learned it was more like a snooze button. Like in the morning you just say, I sleep a bit longer. For those reasons that only data was lost, nothing really happened. Electricity was not lost, the water was still running. So my overall advice to you as Australians, don't wait for that wake-up call, but act now. And even as, citizens, use simple measures to be a bit more cyber secure, and that's part of what you can do. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ethan. We're going to go to Q. There is no amplification. Well, that was really interesting. I'm not someone who can claim to be an expert on any of this. I mean, I generally sort of, when I'm asked to talk about things, I get on stage and talk about, you know, balance of power and things like this. But this is obviously a very relevant dimension to our defence and national security capabilities. I wonder, for the people in the room who aren't experts, whether you could unpack the notion of a cyber reserve a little bit more. It's a term that many here in the audience might be familiar with, but certainly
Mm.
to
Mm.
to Russian trolls and whatnot, or Russian attackers or Chinese attackers or whoever is attacking us at the time. The second question I had was, this is a quote from you. You said, "Look at countries in a worse situation than you are, and learn from the worst." Um, I wonder. I mean, a lot of the issues that you raise seem to me to be geographically context specific, depending on who your enemy is, and I wonder who the who the actors are in our region in Australia, um, from which we could be learning. And it's obviously a loaded question because I'm probably pointing in the direction of Taiwan. And I wonder if you've had anything to do with Taiwan. In Taiwan, are there issues that we need to take into account in learning from them? Thank you.
I start with the last question. No, I don't have any experience in Taiwan. But I would say in cyber, it doesn't even really matter who is the bad guy. You can definitely, we learn a lot from Ukraine because just we have such a close relationship with them. But the bad guys learn from each other a lot. So I often say that when even cyber criminals, let's leave outside the, the state actor or the country that is attacking, cyber business is one of the best coordinated businesses in the world. It's becoming the largest business entity in the world, cybercrime. So it's, when you ask me a question, which countries could you look for? Then obviously, number one, Estonia. And Brendan Doling, the cyber ambassador, did travel to Estonia a while ago. And also Michelle McInnes, I was glad to note. But I guess a wise thing to do is look at different countries and pick up what is relevant for Australia. So I can't comment anything specifically on Taiwan because I simply don't know. But I can definitely see Russian actors also being active here. And we know Russian actors really well. We know how they are organized. We know what they are called. We even know the fact that when they start acting, interestingly enough, Friday afternoon. And when I heard that, my first idea was that it's Friday afternoon because they want to be really annoying to us. So when we want to spend time with our families, they start attacking us. So we couldn't do that. But the real reason is that often those organizations in Russia are the human resources, if I may use that word, are students to earn an extra living. Please, students in the room, don't do that. But that's when they finish their studies on Friday afternoon and start doing the paid job, which is follow the orders from the Russian government. So that's all I can say about who's your enemy. Obviously, you can see Australian attributions. They are online. They are public. It's no secret. You have to look at China. But then again, Russia has cyber has no borders. Russia. Cyber has no borders, and we can see in attacks where Russia has been very active here. On your first question, I can only talk about the Estonian experience. So our defense cyber league helps the cyber reserve, helps the defense in actual attacks against government, more specifically against our defense and other national security entities. And they also take part of all the military exercises in cyber. So that's the defense reserve. Our civil reserve was only created a few years ago. And that was first in the world, as far as I know. And this was created out of necessity because often the critical infrastructure companies, they went to the government as they have to, because they have to notify a government when there's a big attack. And they ask for help from the government, saying that attack is too big. And the government was saying, we can't deal with all of that. This is too much, or we are busy with our own things. So the government actually decided to set together that civil reserve. And the main aim of that reserve is to help with the attacks against critical infrastructure companies. And interestingly enough, obviously it's a help for those companies, but more importantly, it's that learning experience through an actual attack. Remember I said the best way is to learn when somebody attacks you, or the next best is exercise. There is one in between. You actually learn when your friend is attacked. So you go help out your friend. And that's been the even bigger advantage of that cyber civil reserve. Here in Australia, we tried to convince the government that they should be looking into that as well, just to raise that national resilience overall and offer that cooperation between all those entities, government, industry, academia, all of that. And we love exercises in Estonia, so I think that's another part. If that explains a bit.
Yes, that's a very thorough explanation. Okay, do we have any questions in the room? Because, oh, God, we've got a whole load of questions in the room and online. So, Jane, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Bryce, and thanks, Kirsty Esma, for a fantastic presentation. Oh, I'm Jane Hardy, former diplomat, friend of Kirsty's, former colleague in the diplomatic world. Had the great fun of going to the NATO Cyber Centre of Excellence in Tallinn a few years ago. Two-part question. One is, following on from Bryce's most interesting questions, the nature of identifying your attacker, that's the fundamental conundrum in the cyber world compared to normal warfare, or even lawfare, or even hybrid war. You can identify an attacker, but in the cyber world, as you say, it's very hard to, although Estonia's example is interesting because it's been so obvious, and Ukraine's, and other Baltics and Nordics, I'm sure. For us, it's still a vague notion. Eventually, after the attacks you mentioned from recent years, the Australian government may attribute an attacker, but often as not, they don't do so because it's so hard to do. And it's very much a commercial, criminal sort of enterprise, it feels like, as an ordinary Australian, whose Qantas frequent flyer number is probably being used by 6 other people right now. So
you earn points, right? That's
oh, I hope so. But my question is, you've got criminal states emerging. I've been to North Korea several times. It's an interesting place. 20 years ago, it was really starting a very dedicated effort to become an international cyber or online internet player. And it has proven itself to be so. Now it has a reinstated, formal alliance with Russia. It was always there, by the way. The Russians were always in North Korea and the North Koreans were always in Russia, from what I could observe. But now it's formalized, it's out there. Do you see criminal states emerging or criminal actors emerging within states that link up with each other? You mentioned that cyber criminals learn from each other. And here I'm talking about states which have definite criminal activity authorized within them, serving the state itself, not just, students earning a buck on the side or whatever. Sorry, students, you're all very good people, I'm sure. Can you comment on that idea that now globally there are criminal states linking up with each other?
I think, Jane, you answered your own question in the sense, yes, of course. And I think if you look for proof that attack on the Romanian presidential elections, 33 countries the attacks were coming from. So it was not only a state actor, but it was well coordinated effort by a lot of states, not probably 33, all of them, but there's no question about it, what you just described. And that's even more reason why countries like Australia, Estonia, other like-minded countries have to work together. And threat intelligence, change information, learn from each other, to stay alert. And maybe coming back to your question earlier, countries are also dealing with offensive side. So yes, the defense forces are dealing with that side of well. We don't talk about it as much, but it's being dealt as well, because if you want to be in the game, you have to kind of play the game, if that makes sense. But there's no doubt about it. It's coordinated.
Can I pass the? Okay.
Yes, we'd better treat our online listeners to a question or two, because the NATO Strategic Communications Center.
In Riga, or
Oh, he came here and spoke exactly where you were.
the center is in Latvia?
It's in Riga, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. And obviously NATO has set up organizations for people to learn about things. Question comes from Chris Skinner, who's a supporter of the Institute. And
Hello. Hi, Chris.
He asks what NATO. How have you sort of spread this knowledge throughout NATO? Obviously, you're here in Australia talking about things and sharing your knowledge with us. But is the rest of NATO picking up on Estonia's experience and putting policies in place that can help Europe with cyber resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whenever people travel to Europe or Estonia, or they come back with often a feeling like it's such a different world of how we look at threat, more specifically on cyber, how we prepare. So this feeling is definitely shared across NATO, and NATO is preparing as an organization. The center in Tallinn, it's a center of excellence. People often don't understand the difference. NATO has created a lot of centers of excellence, the one of which is in Riga, and in most NATO countries there is a center of excellence. And they're not part of NATO's command. So in that sense, they are not part of NATO's actual defense, which is a separate entity. But they do a lot when it comes to research, exercises, but also working with countries like Australia. Those centers, the participation there is open for non-NATO members. When I was ambassador, and Jane would know about it, one of my goals was to convince Australia to become part of that center, because whenever I explained it to my Australian colleagues, I said, we know Russia, you know China, let's talk. That was basically my elevator pitch. And Australia is now on a road of becoming member. There is an Australian expert there already now for 2 or 3 years. And hopefully one day we will have a flag up, as I like to say it. I don't know if that's Chatham House here, but when I met Richard Marles and I convinced him, okay, I'm not going to say it. Australian flag will be up, hopefully one day. But that's how we, but in NATO, there's so much cooperation as NATO's defense is concerned, but also those NATO centers of excellence support exercises, research, but also cooperation with Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, and Japan. So very like-minded countries when it comes to NATO values. Good question, Chris.
Hello, I'm Mac. I'm just a student at ANU.
Did you say just student?
I suppose.
It's like me saying I'm not technical. You can't
Yeah.
start with, you have to say I'm a student. Anyway, go on.
Fair enough. I'll take that on. My question is sort of kind of a follow-up to the previous one. You mentioned that the best way to learn is by being attacked, and then you later came back to that and said the second best way is by learning from friends. To what extent are nations, obviously cybersecurity is a very sensitive area, to what extent have you found like Estonia or other nations are actually willing to share these things with other states? For example, how much would Estonia share with Finland versus, I don't know, France versus Australia, for example?
We share a lot because we belong all in the EU, the countries you mentioned, except Australia, of course. And with EU partners and with NATO partners, it's a very close cooperation. With Australia, less so, because we are not, Australia is concentrating more on 5I, where there's a lot of cooperation and sharing, but they don't always overlap in that sense. But I think that NATO partnership cooperation, NATO plus Australia, NATO plus New Zealand, NATO plus South Korea, NATO plus Japan, not necessarily NATO plus those 4 countries, but on an individual basis is growing more and more. And obviously, because going back, we have more attacks, so Australia is eager to learn. Maybe to give you a story from when I was ambassador, when I was first posted here, then I thought like, okay, I get to do great things between our countries. And I went to Jane, who was obviously in the DFAT at the time. And we basically had, we talked the same language. I mean, not only English, but our values were so similar. So I went back to embassy and I was a bit like, what am I going to do? We are so similar. And obviously we have our Estonian speaking minority community here, but they act pretty well. They don't cause any trouble. They're not that big. So then I thought, let's try to sell digital identity to Australia. I learned pretty quickly that's not going to work because Australians don't like government issued ID, and it's like not a good thing. And then I discovered cyber, and then I finally saw that Home Affairs and Defence and DFAT became interested because we had something to offer. So coming back to your point, I think Australia is very eager to learn from countries who are in a different situation. I mentioned those visits. They are part of that learning experience, but also Australia being part of that NATO centre is part of that learning. So, but yeah, for Australia, as Australia, it's Five Eyes cooperation that is the most important one.
Hi, I'm Georgia. When Estonia was, like, after the cyber attack, uplifting its cybersecurity, did you take any specific actions to help raise the general cyber hygiene of, like, people working for especially critical infrastructure companies? And is there anything like lessons learned that Australia could take from that?
That was a massive effort. I didn't mention it really as and it was easier for us because if you open that page and service not available or page not found, then every person realized what is a cyber attack, what it can mean. And of course, that is only one attack that I mentioned. We have those attacks happening a lot. What we did, we had a campaign that was aimed at young people more specifically, because what we learned through our digital journey was that when you educate young people and you convince them to do something, for example, multi-factor authentication, then it rolls over to their parents and grandparents. And we can never explain somebody as well as the child or grandchild of that person when it says, no, grandma, you have to actually use multi-factor and I can help you to set it up. And so our effort was definitely on young people and it worked. What we are now struggling the most is scams. When you get, like, even the same in Australia, when, let's say, somebody gets a message that, your parcel is not arriving, can you insert your data here? Very similar to Australia. But we really made the effort to educate the young. And I always give an example of my dad, who is 85 at the moment, and a little bit different from the digital identity side and digital signature. And people have asked me, like, how did your dad learn? He's 85 now. And I said, he learned when he was really young, 75. So I think old people still have brains for all of that. It's just somebody needs to explain it to them who they can trust. And more than often, it's their own children and grandchildren. So please explain to your parents and grandparents that multi-factor authentication and updating your phone is important.
We'll see how brief I can be. Sally Burt, I'm from UNSW Canberra. Mike, I think I know the answer to this, but we'll see. And I apologise, I came in late. But when I came in, I think you were being quite pessimistic about the norms, the 11 norms, the UNGGE, and the norm development around cyber. And I was just curious what your thoughts about perhaps an arms control type regime as opposed to a norm setting. Well, I mean, it would be a form of norms, but what appetite and or effectiveness do you think a kind of arms limitations regime might work in?
I'm not an expert in this. I'm never, when I was a diplomat and we had a appointment of cyber ambassador, and I first heard the term cyber diplomacy, and I think it was pretty much the first time I heard cyber as a word even. And then they organized us a whole day of training in cyber diplomacy. And I was sitting there and I said, why do I listen to a bunch of lawyers? Isn't cyber supposed to be something different? Maybe. But then again, cyber, coming back to the point that so often you don't have the author, you don't have the person actually, or you don't have the country who does it. While in armed control, it's much more visible. So it's that deflecting, it wasn't me. No, I didn't leave the dirty dishes in the sink, Mom. So it's, I don't know. What's your answer? You said you started that you know the answer.
I thought I knew the answer of your thinking, but I mean, my thinking is it a way to bring out some transparency, right, and do confidence building in this space and get a conversation going about what we are all trying to do in that space?
When you look what Russia did in UN regarding that cyber, they said we need a separate agreement, a separate charter, just specific. It sounds pretty good on paper, right? Like, why wouldn't we have? And when you look into that, the countries like Estonia and Australia were saying international rule already applies. So it's what I'm trying to say, if there's a will, there's a way. But I think there's no will